Quiet quitting is on the rise amongst employees, and we find out why for the record.
Yeah, this is a phenomenon that everyone's talking about at the moment, and I think it's timely because of what's happened coming out of remote work and COVID and what people are thinking about. We've been talking for quite a long time about this life audit concept. There's nothing quite like a global pandemic to get you to focus on your own mortality and your own future and what it is to be a human and what meaning and what matters in your life. And as such, a lot of people have been questioning their work-life balance. This has, of course, only been exacerbated by the fact that many people have been working from home. And what we figured out with working from home is that it doesn't actually reduce your working day. Quite often, it just stretches it. And of course, those boundaries between what is work and what is home and what is real life and what is working life have just become more blurred. So this is why it's so topical right now. But what quiet quitting really is about employees just doing the bare minimum. And it's fascinating because there's actually a term known as I think it's the grève du soleil, which is a sort of a French term for a work to rule strike, which is where workers follow their job contracts to the absolute letter, and as such can actually grind entire companies to a halt. In other words, only following your KPIs, doing just as you're told and nothing more. That is the essence behind quiet quitting. So it's almost a form of rebellion, but it's also a form of mental health and reclaiming your boundaries. There's many ways to look at this topic, but what it really boils down to is employees only working the bare minimum and refusing to take on additional work or additional tasks, or to answer those emails or pick up those phone conversations or those Slack channel or Discord messages after hours. It's about drawing very clear lines between what you're paid to do and what you're not paid to do. Like the whole sort of not my circus, not my clowns conversation.
Now, having said that, has it always been there, or is this something new?
Well, it's always been there with some people, right? I mean, there's always people that you know are the guys that arrive exactly at 8 a.m. in the morning and clock out at exactly 4. And if you ask them to stay late, they'll say, absolutely not. These are the same people that take their lunch hour on the hour, will leave the building and come back exactly 1 hour later, will refuse to help a colleague with something else, saying, that's not my job. People that have very clear boundaries. There's nothing wrong with having boundaries, but when it comes to working in an office, in an organization, a company is largely to do with culture, and it's to do with relationships, and it's to do with pulling together to solve problems. So if everyone in your organization is thinking that way, you're not likely to have a very healthy or successful organization. It's a very similar problem, actually, to what happens in society at large. It's a question around the social contracts we have developed in our societies. So in a more sort of like political sense, I think there's a lot of parallels to what's going on in South African society too. Our social contract is that as a society, as a nation state, as a community, we come together and we give up some physical and some physical privileges in the form of taxation, in the form of submitting to laws and rules and order. And in exchange, we get some benefits in terms of like law and order and security and, border control. And we get some physical safety nets too, in the form of like social grants, for example. So there's a trade, right, in society where we all have to participate. We have to give some, we have to get some, and then hopefully we all move forward together. But if everyone is only giving the bare minimum and nobody's putting in anything extra, we have these sort of common goods problems that we talk about in economics, right? Where everyone takes the most and no one contributes or puts anything back, and you end up not being able to move forward. Now, in a company, in an organizational sense, the same sorts of things happen. You want to build a healthy community and a healthy society around your company that people are excited to go to work for, that there's meaning and motivation beyond just the mere paycheck that's driving that company forward. That's the way we talk about purpose and your North Star and all of these good things. And when your organization loses that and becomes a purely sort of, accounting balance spreadsheet relationship, you don't become a very competitive or a very healthy organization. Now, my colleague and my partner, Dion Chang, talks about this concept of there's sort of 3 different relationship types we get as human beings. We have familial relationships, the relationships of our families. Then we have neighbor relationships. Then we have stranger-based relationships. And the distinction between those different relationships is in our families, we do things for people just because we like them. We invest in future relationships, understanding that investment might only be repaid 20, 30 years down the line. We treat our children nicely. We invest in them. We send them to good schools, even when they're horrible little brats to us, right? We like them and we love them and we invest in those relationships, knowing that that makes our lives richer in the future. And of course, we don't expect to give so much trust and to sort of invest so much without a direct reciprocal return in our other relationships with our neighbors or with our businesses or with our nation states. But there is still that sort of degree of trust that makes relationships work, that I'm going to give something today and maybe in the future I'll recoup that, even if I'm not repaid directly. And this is where we start to have problems in organizations when we start to treat our employees versus our employers sort of based relationship as a purely stranger-based relationship where there's no invested trust, right? Where everything has to be settled up immediately. In other words, I won't work late unless you pay me overtime today. On the surface, that's completely fair. That's setting great boundaries. But at the same time, if no one's prepared to put in extra effort, how is that organization ever going to really grow in the future? So in other words, healthy organizations have some degree of reciprocal trust built into them, and we need to be able to sort of treat our colleagues, our employees, our employers more as neighbors than as strangers if we want to have healthy relationships. So it's a complicated issue. There's no sort of clear villains and, good guys in this scenario, but rather it's a case that when trust breaks down and relationship tallies have to be settled up in the minute, we end up with things like quiet quitting and quiet firing, which is another sort of reciprocal trend we see coming out of this. That's when employers start to sideline employees and trying to make them leave the organization by cutting them out of, conversations. So we see a lot of this going on, but I think the underlying issue is trust and that social contract where we have to give something to get something back.
How are we likely going to see this impacting the relationship that currently exists between employer and employee moving forward, of course?
Yeah, so this ties into a trend we've been looking at for some time. It comes back down to that relationship, much like I mentioned in terms of the nation state. It's a physical sort of trade. We give up some to get some. And the way that organizations have worked with employees in the past has been very much the same sort of thing. We give up our time as employees, and in exchange we get physical security in the form of a defined paycheck. And that works when we have sort of trust-based relationships. When that trust breaks down and when employees start to do the bare minimum or to try and cut corners or to double time their bosses running 2 jobs at the same time, it's no surprise that employers push back with more sort of staff surveillance, and that sort of erodes and undermines all the trust again. So we'll be able to sort of break out of these cycles to shift those relationships to be based on sort of like time exchanges and sort of that surveillance sort of interaction towards more outcomes-based relationships. So we see this a lot. We're seeing this with organizations shifting pay packages from salaries towards more sort of freelance or contract type relationships, therefore allowing that employee to set their own boundaries without having to manage people with the rule to work sort of strike type phenomenon that ends up breaking down when we get to sort of like the logical conclusion of the breakdown of these relationships. It's a way out of that. So we start to remunerate people for the value that they bring out, not for the effort that they put in. And a lot of these sort of macro trends, the same thing that's playing out with the likes of the whole sort of decentralized autonomous organizations and the philosophy of the code behind a lot of the things in the crypto, blockchain, DeFi's whole sort of way of thinking, which I think is quite interesting when we see these trends are playing out really everywhere. But it's the shift to what value are you delivering, bringing out at the end of the day, rather than what sort of pure time you're putting in. And that way we're able to break down those boundaries altogether and allow people to make their own, which can be much healthier relationships.
Now, having said that, what advice would you give employers at the end of the day in terms of managing the relationship that they currently have with their employees?
Well, I think this is a two-way street, right? It all comes down to that idea of trust, and that people won't put in extra effort or take on tasks that are not literally in their job description if they don't believe there's going to be any reciprocity from the company. In other words, if you do put in extra effort and you see that's rewarded for something like maybe you're getting sort of share options in your company or a raise or a promotion, if that extra effort is rewarded, even if it's not rewarded immediately, it's rewarded further down the line, people are more likely to avoid quiet quitting type trends. However, if that extra effort is consistently not rewarded and companies are taking advantage of people's goodwill and putting in extra time and cutting into those work-life boundaries, then employers must expect people to stop putting that effort in. So it's got to work both ways. If organizations do want to avoid the quiet quitting phenomenon, they have to give back what people are putting in. And that then you can build trust-based relationships rather than pure economic value exchange-based relationships, which is obviously less healthy, but can be done in decentralized autonomous organizations where we sort of cut the human being out of the whole loop altogether and just run on a pure capitalism, which is basically the alternative to this.